Yeah. Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair will be authorized to declare recesses during votes in the House. Today's hearing examines the ongoing threat posed by gangs and the evolution of gangs in America. Over the past 20 or more years, gangs have evolved from localized criminal organizations to international criminal enterprises vying for control of sophisticated criminal schemes, often with the threat or use of violence. Today, gangs are increasingly engaged in non-traditional gang-related crimes such as alien smuggling, human trafficking, and prostitution. Gangs are also engaging in white-collar crimes such as counterfeiting, identity theft, and mortgage fraud. They have become transnational criminal organizations and compete with many other criminal organizations. According to the 2011 National Gang Threat Assessment, there are approximately 1.4 million gang members belonging to more than 33,000 gangs in the United States. It has been reported that the number of gang members in the U.S. increased by 40% since 2009. Today's tough economic environment has made it even easier for gangs to recruit new members. In the year 2000, more than 50% of all American teens had a job. Last summer, less than 30% had a job. More teenagers on the streets with nothing to do foster opportunities that gangs now have to increase their membership. As the traditional family unit continues to change in America, young people seek a sense of belonging. For many teenagers, a gang becomes a new family for them. Unfortunately, the values thought by these new families include aggression, brutality, and violence. Another significant threat is the acquisition of high-powered military-style weapons and equipment by gangs. Typically, gangs acquire firearms through illegal purchases, straw purchases, and thefts. Gang members also target military and law enforcement officials, facilities, and vehicles to obtain weapons, ammunition, body armor, police badges, uniforms, and official identification. This increases the potential for lethal encounters with law enforcement officers and civilians. Gangs continue to evolve and become more violent. According to the FBI, gangs are responsible for an average of 40% of violent crime in most jurisdictions and up to 90% in several others. Gangs are also becoming more sophisticated, employing new and advanced technologies to facilitate criminal activity discreetly and to enhance their criminal operations. They use the latest methods of communication to connect with other gang members, criminal organizations, and potential recruits nationwide and worldwide. According to the current threats posed by gangs are quite serious. There are many stories of success which I hope will reverse the current trend. In 2007, the City of Los Angeles, with the recommendations of the Advancement Project, implemented 2 programs aimed at reducing gang violence. In just 5 years, these programs have significantly decreased the number of homicides and violent crimes in city parks that are located in so-called gang violence hot zones. Sometimes community policing and intervention must give way to enforcement and suppression due to the frequency and intensity of gang violence. Chicago is in the grips of a deadly gang war. Over 275 people have been killed in Chicago so far this year, and many more have been shot, many of them innocent bystanders to the gang violence. The Chicago Police Department has 200 officers assigned to its gang enforcement unit versus 100,000 gang members in Chicago. Last month, Chicago Police Sergeant Matt Little likened Chicago's gang problem to tribal warfare. He said it continues to build unless we manage to interdict it and manage to stop it long enough for the blood to stop boiling and the heat to die down. This discouraging situation will hopefully be tempered by efforts by educators such as Mr. King, who are working hard to reduce the susceptibility of recruitment by gangs. Other large U.S. cities are experiencing varying degree of success in addressing recruitment into gangs and gang-related crimes. This hearing will explore the tools available to address gang recruitment, crime, and violence, which range from enforcement and suppression to community policing and intervention, and are often a combination of both. The hearing will specifically examine the evolving gang threats in Chicago, parts of Minnesota, and Los Angeles. We are joined today by 4 witnesses who have dedicated their efforts to put a stop to violent gangs and to prevent the recruitment of America's youth into these criminal organizations. I look forward to hearing about their experiences and successes in addressing this serious national challenge. Without objection, the statement of the Department of Justice will be submitted into the record at this point, and it is now my pleasure to recognize for his opening statement the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Congressman Bobby Scott, who has made one of the 50 most beautiful people on the Hill. Mr. Scott.
Since you're going to mention that, I also made the 25 hardest working. I made that list too, so a couple of years ago.
Well, I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for scheduling this hearing on gangs. As you and the longer-serving members of this subcommittee are aware, preventing violence and crime by young people, particularly gang violence and crime through gangs, has been an issue which we've worked on for a significant amount of time since I've been in Congress. We have recently passed through the Judiciary Committee a reauthorization of the Juvenile Accountability Block Grant Program, which resulted from a collaborative effort with former Crime Subcommittee Chairman Bill McCollum of Florida and every member of the subcommittee, with each member on both sides serving as co-sponsors. The bill was first passed in the committee in 1999 and has passed from the committee a total of 6 times with the help of former Crime Subcommittee Chairman Smith and Coble during their terms there and beyond. We've also led or supported reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974 on several occasions. Unfortunately, despite what the science and evidence strongly say, my 35 years of experience as a legislator at the state and federal level has been one that when it comes to crime policy, we almost never pay any attention to science and evidence. That's why we've seen a 90% reduction in the amount of money spent on prevention and intervention since 2000, and that's why we have not been able to pass legislation such as the Youth Promise Act. When it comes to crime, we have a choice. We can do what the science and evidence says and reduce crime, or we can participate in the politics of crime. Politics of crime involve the tough-on-crime slogans and sound bites, such as poll-tested slogans like 3 strikes and you're out, abolish parole, truth in sentencing, mandatory minimum sentences, or if we can get it to rhyme, it's even better. If you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. Research and evidence show us that while these tough-on-crime approaches sound good, they range from having little to do with preventing crime to actually increasing the crime rate. Under the Get Tough on Crime approach, no matter how tough we were last year, you got to get tougher this year. And we've been getting tougher year by year for about 30 years now, since 1980. We've gone from around 200,000 prisoners incarcerated in the United States to over 2 million, with annual costs going up accordingly. As a result of these approaches, today the United States is the world's leading incarcerator by far, with an incarceration rate 7 times that of the international average. The world average is about 100 to between 50 and 200 prisoners per 100,000. The rate in the United States is over 700 per 100,000. African Americans, about 2,200. 10 states lock up blacks at the rate of almost 4,000 per 100,000. And yet the violence and crime and gangs persist, and we can look at what's happening in Chicago and New Orleans. We can show that it's growing. Regardless of all the people we've incarcerated from our tough-on-crime approaches, this situation still persists. Research as well as common sense tells us that no matter how tough we are on people we prosecute today, unless we are addressing the underlying reasons for crime, young people will follow the same trajectory and nothing will change. The next crime cohort will simply replace the ones we take out and crime continues, so just getting tough will not reduce crime. All the credible research and evidence shows that a comprehensive strategy of evidence-based interventions and supports aimed at-risk youth will greatly reduce crime. They will save much more money than they cost when compared to money that otherwise would have been spent on law enforcement and other criminal justice and social welfare system costs. These approaches are the most effective when provided in a context of a coordinated, collaborative strategy involving law enforcement, education, social services, mental health, nonprofit, faith-based, and other groups, business representatives who work with identified children at risk of involvement in the criminal justice system. We saw a demonstration of this in my district in the city of Richmond, Virginia, through a grant program costing $2.5 million from the Federal Gang Reduction Program, a collaborative effort of federal, state, and local governments and community organizations established an anti-gang strategy which reduced the murder rate in the targeted area from 19 to 2. Due to medical advances, there are about 4 to 5 times more shooting victims that survive for every one that dies. So the 19 murders represented about 80 shootings, all of which were likely to be indigent care patients at the Medical College of Virginia Emergency Facility in Richmond. When you compare the cost of 80 shootings to that of around 8, the difference alone probably saved more than $2.5 million. And when you add the fewer arrests, prosecutions, incarcerations, the savings really add up. Los Angeles had a similar pilot project and experienced similar results, so much more of that has become part of the foundation for establishing its comprehensive citywide anti-gang program, which we'll hear about today. So as we look at issues of growing threats from gang crime in this country, I believe that we again will be faced with the choice of doing what has been proven to reduce crime or what is proven to be good politics, and unfortunately the two do not match. I can only hope that we will consider seriously this time the science, evidence, and demonstrated effectiveness, which I expect that we'll hear about today as to what has been proven to be effective and what is not. This doesn't mean that we stop addressing serious crimes with strong law enforcement. We must do that, and we will continue. But it simply means that we shouldn't stop there. We need to focus on fewer crimes being committed. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Commander Bob Green has been the Assistant Commanding Officer of Operations South Bureau of the LAPD since 1910. Previously, he held many other positions with the LAPD. He became a police student worker in 1978 and entered the police academy in 1980. Commander Green was promoted to lieutenant in 1999 and assigned as a watch commander. In 2004, Commander Green was promoted to captain and was assigned as a patrol commanding officer. The following year, Commander Green was promoted to Captain 2 and assigned as the commanding officer, LAPD Field Services Division at the Los Angeles International Airport. In 2007, he was promoted to Captain 3. Commander Green attended Cal State University at Long Beach, Loyola Marymount University, and the Union Institute. He holds an Associate Arts degree in Administration of Justice and a Bachelor of Science degree in Law Enforcement Leadership and Management. Sheriff Richard Stanek is the 27th Sheriff of Hennepin County, Minnesota, which is the largest county there. He was first sworn in on January 1, 2007, and was reelected in 2010. In January, Sheriff Stanek began a 2-year term as president of the Major County Sheriff's Association. He serves on the board of directors of the National Sheriff's Association and co-chairs the NSA Homeland Security Committee, as well as being active in the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Sheriff Stanek began his career in the Minneapolis Police Department. He rose through the ranks from patrol officer, detective, precinct commander to commander of criminal investigations. While a police officer, Sheriff Stanek was elected 5 times to the Minnesota House of Representatives, and he chaired the House Crime Policy and Finance Committee. In 2003, he was appointed by the governor as Commissioner of Public Safety and Director of Homeland Security. He earned a criminal justice degree from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in public administration from Hamline University. Tim King is the founder, president, and CEO of Urban Prep Academies, a nonprofit organization operating a network of public college prep boys' schools in Chicago, including the nation's first all-male charter high school and related programs aimed at promoting college success. Mr. King also serves as an adjunct lecturer at Northwestern University and has contributed to the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Huffington Post. He holds a doctorate honoris causa from Adler School and received a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service and Juris Doctor degrees from Georgetown. Ms. Constance Rice has been co-director and attorney at the Advancement Project since 1998. She is also a partner at English, Munger, and Rice. Previously, she spent 9 years in the Los Angeles office of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Prior to this position, she was president of the Board of Commissioners at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, special assistant to the associate vice chancellor at UCLA, and previously was an associate attorney at Morrison and Foerster. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard and her JD degree from NYU. Without objection, all of your statements will be printed in full in the record. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be printed in the record. As you know, we ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. There will be lights in front of you to coach you when your time is up, and the chair recognizes Commander Green.
Morning, Mr. Chair and council members. It's an honor to be here. I think it's important I put my testimony in context. For 3 decades, I've done very aggressive law enforcement work in Los Angeles. I believe that it was all about handcuffs and, as Ms. Rice would say, shock and awe. We spiked in violent crime during the late 80s and early 90s in Los Angeles, and we were seen as the murder capital of the country. And we responded with very aggressive suppression. We'd bring in 500 cops to an area of the city, and anything that looked like criminal activity, we'd address. A lot of citations, a lot of people went to jail. A short period of time, it reduced violence and gang violence, but overwhelmingly, we eroded our relationship with the community. We lost community trust, which ultimately set the stage for the civil unrest in Los Angeles in 1992. We struggled with programs for about 10 years, and in 2007, with the leadership of Ms. Rice, the Urban Peace Institute and Advancement Project came together with their strategy to their call to action in Los Angeles. And Mayor Villaraigosa followed that up with his gang initiatives and established the Gang Reduction Youth Development Office. And for me, initially, it was extraordinarily distasteful that I would have to partnership with ex-offenders and shot callers to reduce violent crime. And I sit humbly before you today saying that I could not have been more wrong. Based on those relationships with the ex-offenders, the wraparound programs that we have in Los Angeles, we have reduced crime dramatically and gang crime. To have intervention workers respond after a shooting in partnership, a true partnership with law enforcement, to reduce potential additional shootings or retaliation shootings has been very, very successful. Building those relationships with people that have influence in a neighborhood that we do not has paid significant dividends. The community engagement programs, Summer Night Lights, where we're bringing gang members, community members, law enforcement, intervention workers together at a recreation center to role model expected behavior, has been very successful. The Community Safety Partnership, we've gone into 4 of the most troubled housing developments of the city of Los Angeles. We've put 10 cops in each one of those developments, not for suppression, but for community programs. In the 8 months that they've been in existence, we've seen a dramatic reduction in crime. But most importantly, we've seen an unprecedented improvement in the relationship between those communities and law enforcement. Watts Gang Task Force, where we used to have nothing but conflict and finger pointing, has been impressively successful in our ability to get along and ensure progress. Now, that doesn't mean that suppression has gone out the window. Suppression is an important element, but it needs to be strategic, and it needs to be done in a partnership with the community, not for the community. Our federal partnerships and local partnerships with the city attorney's office, the district attorney's office for injunctions and enhancements, vital part of the overall cocktail that's helped in LA. The FBI's programs for the Save Our Streets Task Force has given us the ability in the last 2 years to increase our homicide clearance rate by 20% to an unprecedented 80%, which is important because once an individual starts to shoot, there's nothing to slow him down. And so the quicker we can get that individual off the street and target just the violent offenders, the better off we are, and we're able to reduce additional shootings and homicides. Their Safe Street Partnership, working with our gang members to give us additional logistics and technology and financial support, is critical to us. The relationships with the DEA and ATF on these task forces to be able to partnership and have strategic suppression for violence, not just for gang suppression, but for the violent element of that community, to remove them from the community so they can't continue to offend. But we've got to do all that with wraparound. And the ability to work with shot callers, ex-gang members in partnership with law enforcement does tremendous things when we walk into recreation centers, and you can walk up and hug a thug and he can hug a cop, as we call it. But ultimately, that role modeling has done tremendous things for us in our ability to establish those relationships in the community. So as we move forward in LA, we'll continue strategic suppression, but without a doubt, the intervention, prevention programs are the root of a lot of our success now in Los Angeles.
Thank you very much, Commander. And, you know, believe me, your reputation has come in advance of you here. And we're happy to see something that works rather than hear about things that don't. Sheriff Stanek?
Well, thank you, Chairman Sensenbrenner, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Rich Stanek, Sheriff of Hennepin County. I'm here today on behalf of the National Sheriff's Association, where I serve on the board of directors, and I'm the chair of their Homeland Security Committee. This year, I also began a 2-year term as president of the Major County Sheriff's Association. I've been asked to testify today about the specific emergence of Somali gang-related issues we are having in my county. The Minnesota Somali population has been estimated in the range of 80 to 125,000, and a majority of them live in Hennepin County. Whereas the African population represented 4% in the United States in 2008, in Minnesota, Africans represent 18% of our population because Minnesota is a designated U.S. refugee resettlement area. I'd like to state for the record that the Somali community as a whole is made up of law-abiding citizens who came to Minnesota as refugees and are now an important part of our community. Mr. Chair and members, Somali gangs are unique in that they are not necessarily based on the narcotics trade as are other traditional gangs. Most successful gang prosecutions require a narcotics nexus. Somali gang criminal activities are not based on a certain geographical area or turf. And gang members will often congregate in certain areas but commit their criminal acts elsewhere. Criminal acts are often done in a wide geographic area that stretches outside of the Twin Cities, 7-county metro area, and their mobility has made them difficult to track. Mr. Chair and members, let me describe several typical crimes committed by Somali gangs. First, credit card fraud. Recently, Somali gangs have committed a high volume of credit card skimming and credit card fraud. Credit card skimming is a high reward and a low-risk crime. The skimming is done by acquiring a skimming device, computer, and the necessary software. In Minnesota, we're seeing trends where gangs will recruit individuals, often restaurant employees, to perform skimming during work hours and then give the skimming device back to the gang members. These cases are difficult for law enforcement, often requiring a large amount of time since the cards are often not used locally. In credit card fraud cases, an investigator must find the victim and the location of the initial skimming. Now, there can be numerous victims from one skimming operation. Surveillance videos necessary and computer forensics are essential in order to identify suspects. Secondly would be witness intimidation. Somali gangs readily engage in witness tampering and intimidation. In Somali culture, if a crime is committed against a family, clan, or tribe, remittances are paid to family members. Somalis in Hennepin County have continued this remittance payment practice. Now, we've learned that victims' families often prefer to negotiate financial remittances rather than follow through with judicial prosecution. Now, oftentimes the payments are made directly to relatives in Somalia. This remittance payment continues to interfere in the successful prosecution of gang members. And witness intimidation by Somali gang members has become an ongoing threat to successful prosecutions. In a recent homicide trial in Hennepin County, a witness recanted his earlier testimony, and another witness refused to return from London in order to testify. Now, we believe there were direct threats of violence made to witnesses and family members. The suspect in this case, a known Somali gang member, was tried but acquitted by a jury. The homicide is believed to have been in retaliation for previous testimony provided by opposing gang members in another homicide. The third are gun store burglaries. In July of 2008, a gun store in Minnetonka, Minnesota was burglarized. The suspects took 57 handguns, and through the investigation it was determined that the guns were taken by members of the Somali outlaws. Through tracking of recovered guns, it was determined that the majority of guns were either traded or sold to other known gang members. These same guns were then used in homicides, aggravated assaults, shootings, and robberies. 27 of those stolen handguns have yet been recovered. Fourth is a terrorism nexus to gang activity. In 2007, the local Somali community started to report that some of the youth in the area had essentially disappeared without warning. It was later learned that 20 young men had left Minneapolis to travel to Somalia to receive training and fight as members of al-Shabaab. One individual had moved to Minneapolis as a teenager in 1983, and following a shoplifting arrest, he fell into the violent street gang called the Somali Hot Boys. After a short period of time, he emerged as a recruiter for al-Shabaab, which eventually led him to leave Minneapolis for the Horn of Africa in 2008. Later, it was learned this individual was killed in fighting between al-Shabaab and Somali government forces. And Mr. Chair, members, in conclusion, the Somali gangs have emerged as a serious threat to community safety, both in Hennepin County, and a unique challenge to our law enforcement resources. These gangs are involved in multiple criminal activities that require sophisticated and resource-intensive law enforcement investigations. They're growing in influence and violence. They demonstrate the importance of multi-jurisdictional law enforcement information sharing and practice certain cultural behaviors that render some traditional U.S. criminal justice tools less effective. We're clearly faced with a challenge that requires an innovative approach, including new investigative tools and focused resources. And Mr. Chair and members, I look forward to working with Congress and our law enforcement partners to identify and implement smart and cost-effective solutions. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheriff. Mr. King.
It is a tremendous honor to be asked to give testimony to the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, and to be able to offer a perspective from the field of education. For that opportunity, I would like to thank the Chairman, Vice Chair, as well as Ranking Member Scott and the other members of the subcommittee. I would also like to recognize Representative Quigley of the Illinois 5th Congressional District, who is no doubt familiar with the issues affecting our city. Chicago is in a profound state of crisis. With every weekend comes another round of bloodshed. Between June 22nd and the 24th, 4 people were killed, including 2 boys aged 13 and 14, and 30 were wounded. Between June 29th and July 1st, 17 people were wounded, including a 3-year-old and 9-year-old. 9 people were killed. So far this year, more Americans have been murdered in the streets of Chicago than in service in Afghanistan. Chicago has seen 4 times as many murders since January as New York City, and last week, as the country awoke to the intensely tragic news that a masked gunman had opened fire in a Colorado movie theater, I was learning that 2 teenagers in Chicago had been killed and another wounded. That wounded teenager is a rising senior at Urban Prep named DeMarcus Brown. I founded Urban Prep Academies, the country's first network of all-boys charter public high schools, in large part as a response to some of the factors that are currently playing out in the form of this summer's violence. Since our founding, 100% of Urban Prep's graduates have been admitted to college. This is a major accomplishment for any school, but given that all of our graduates are African-American males and that there are exceptional challenges facing this population, the achievement is even more significant. In order to shed light on the state of affairs of being a young black male in a violence-filled community, Urban Prep's sophomore, Yaviel Ivy, was recently asked to record a month-long video diary for CBS News. Toting a camcorder on his way to and from school, Mr. Ivy chronicled the daily violence he witnessed. "I don't expect to have a future in my neighborhood. I want better for myself," he said in one entry. In another entry, Mr. Ivy told about being asked by a gang member what gang he was affiliated with, narrowly escaping when he responded that he was neutral. There are as many as 600 Chicago gangs with approximately 150,000 members. Mr. Ivy comes from a home in which he is loved and supported. He is a straight-A student who wants to become an entrepreneur. Yet even the advantages of family, intellect, and ambition cannot protect him from the violence that threatens his community. For Mr. Ivy, like so many other young people, simply walking out of the front door can be a dangerous undertaking. To address this problem, we must offer hope to communities and people plagued by violence. The only way we'll staunch the violence is to persuade those committing violent acts that they have something to lose, that there are opportunities for enjoyment and advancement that don't come at the expense of those around them, that there are paths to respect that don't go through fear. But hope is not enough. We need further support for schools like Urban Prep and others that are committed to educating our city's most vulnerable children. We need engaged community organizations, empathetic law enforcement, and government that invests heavily in the well-being of its citizens. In the end, what we need is action. Action that will ensure that all children, all Americans are safe. DeMarcus, the urban prep student who was shot last week, is still in the hospital. His older brother, Eric, was also an urban prep student. I say was because he graduated this past year, having been accepted to college at multiple colleges and receiving the Gates Millennium Scholarship, which will cover all of his college and graduate school expenses. This fall, he'll be enrolling at Howard University right here in our nation's capital. What a tragic juxtaposition. One brother on his way to college and another in the hospital fighting for his life. Eric Brown is proof that it is possible to end these cycles of violence one child at a time. His younger brother, DeMarcus, is a tragic reminder of what happens if we do not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. King. This is very inspiring. Ms. Rice?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for having me, Congressman Scott, all the other members. It's an honor to be here. I hail from Los Angeles, the gang capital of...
Can you move your mic?
Can you move your mic a little closer, do you please?
Okay, can you hear me?
Is it on?
Okay. Good morning.
Better.
You can hear me. Okay, good. Thank you. Again, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here. Mr. King gave a very moving statement, and his work is critically important for one child at a time. I come from Los Angeles. There are over 100,000 gang members, 1,000 gangs. We spent $35 billion over 25 billion over 35 years, and we have 6 times as many gangs and at least 3 times as many gang members. You heard Commander Green talk about when we were at war. My first reaction to the fundamental belief that I have that the first civil right is the right to safety. The first freedom is freedom from violence. I'm looking at children who die at the ages of 10 and 11 and get accosted by gangs. In LA's gang hotspots, in LA County, we have over 850,000 innocent children trapped in gang hotspots that Commander Green and LAPD and the sheriffs have been patrolling and fighting and battling in a war. That war has cost us $35 billion, and we have far more of the problem. It's not that we didn't need very brave officers to combat, but it wasn't ending the gang mentality, it wasn't ending the spread of gang culture, and it was not ending the violence. The kids were more in danger than ever. The cops were more in danger. There have been over 60 officers murdered in our gang hotspots, and 100,000 Angelenos shot over the last 25 years. When we took a look at this issue, we were asked, my group, the Advancement Project, was asked by the City of Los Angeles and its ad hoc committee, city council level, to tell the region why LA was stuck on stupid when it came to reducing gangs, reducing gang membership, reducing the hold of gang culture on LA. What we did is we pulled together 35 experts. Anytime you put lawyers and 35 experts together, you're going to get a big report. The report weighed 12.5 pounds and was 1,000 pages long. The only good thing about that is that it was too big to ignore, because we had ignored every other report. 35 experts, including law enforcement. And you want to know what they said? They said you can't litigate your way out of it, looking at me, because I had filed, I don't know how many lawsuits, Commander Green, how many times did I sue you? I sued. I woke up every day trying to figure out a new way to sue on class actions, not just regular. And I was at war with LAPD and the sheriffs and trying to get constitutional policing. They were at war with the gangs. We were all fighting each other, and the kids were dying. So we got unstuck off of stupid. And we said, you want to know something? The civil rights litigators don't have the answer, and shock and awe policing suppression doesn't have the answer either. Both may be necessary, but we're not getting the job done. The kids are not safer. What we did is we wrote that report together, and as Sergeant McBride said, Connie, I don't even like you, but you want to know something? I'm going to join you on this report, because when I retired after 40 years of being on the Sheriff's Department, I just arrested the grandson of the man I first arrested when I got 2 weeks out of the Sheriff's Academy, and I arrested his dad 10 years ago. I have destroyed 3 generations of that family, and the next generation is going into the gangs. So when we decided to take a fresh lens on this problem, we came up with a comprehensive violence reduction focus and strategy. That's the strategy that Commander Green is talking about. Instead of suing each other, we now have each other on speed dial. We work all the time together. We have comprehensive prevention, comprehensive suppression, strategic suppression, re-entry, and wraparound security for the kids. Look at the data. The data tells you the truth. While Chicago is going up by 33%, LA's gang crime has gone down another 20%. And Summer Night Lights, where the GRID office works, our Gang Reduction and Youth Development Office, which is in the mayor's office, where that works at Summer Night Lights magic, gang homicides plummet 57%. Nowhere in the country does that happen. You want to know why? It's because we are working together like a symphony. We're not just playing separate instruments in a corner. We are conducted by the gang czar, Guillermo Cespedes, together, by the chief of police and by the mayor. And we all get in the boat and row together to keep kids safe. That's the comprehensive wraparound. Yes, the threat is going up, but please don't have the Pavlovian response of shock and awe. We need strategic responses, and we have to understand that what we've been doing in the past isn't getting the job done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. The chair is going to defer his questions to the end and now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. And we certainly appreciate your expertise and your looking at these issues. And I think all of us agree that we need to work together. I mean, there's no question about that. We also agree that we need to have prevention programs. We need to work strategically. But I'd like to just look at a few statistics. According to the statistics that I have, we now have about 1.4 million active gang members in the country, and that's a rise of about 40% since 2009. Do any of you dispute those statistics, or do they seem fairly accurate to you and what we're doing? Sheriff, you mentioned the Somali gangs that you have. Where do most of those gang members come from? How do they get involved in the gangs?
Yeah, Chairman Sensenbrenner and Congressman, generally, many of the Somalian folks who live in my community, the 80 to 125,000, the vast majority of them were refugees who came to Minnesota through that resettlement agreement. But now you're reaching into the first generation, so many of these young people are now 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe even 14 years old. They're growing up in a culture in which they're finding that turning to gangs is unfortunately somewhat a way of life for them. Very unfortunate. And so we are working hard to try and find ways to reach them early on. Early childhood family education type programs, intervention, educators, the faith community, and others. But some came with that, but for the most part, the young people who are now entering gangs, Mr. Congressman, are folks who have grown up here in the United States into these families.
How about, do any of you have any exposure to MS-13 in your areas? And Ms. Rice, do you have two, Commander?
Yes, sir. In Los Angeles, we have a significant component of MS-13.
Where are they recruiting most of their members? How do they get them?
MS-13 typically throughout the neighborhoods, and this is second, third generation, and it's some of it is built into the family. But MS-13 is very embedded in the prison system, and based on our current system within the prisons, they have the ability to communicate outside and continue to not only force recruitment, but action from prison.
How are we going after their networks? You know, the leadership of the networks, because the networks tend to run these gangs, and if we continue to just take people off the streets that are lower tier, we're not doing anything. They're going to replace them over and over again. What are your efforts at going after the networks, and how are you effectively taking those networks out?
In Los Angeles, it's strategy. It's mostly our task forces. You know, our goal are the leadership, to diagram out those gangs, target the leadership of the gangs, and remove them. But unfortunately, there is a void that is filled almost immediately because it is very, very lucrative. And so as you continue to have that financial incentive, each time we remove a top member of that gang, the void is filled almost immediately, and we have to continue our efforts to eradicate it through individuals.
Ms. Rice?
Thank you. I think you've raised a very, very important point. MS is one of the gangs, as Commander Green indicates, that is probably one of the most violent and probably most linked in California with the large drug distribution networks, which are run from our prisons. That is the main vector for the messages that go out to control the drug trade in California anyway. If we could get hold and control of our prisons and break it up, MS is one of the gangs that has linked up with the prison gangs, and the prison gang has linked up with the cartels. But I don't want us to overreact to that. We need a very focused, hierarchical strategy, because with organized international, transnational threats, you have to go for the hierarchy. If you do that with street gangs, however, you end up causing a metastasis of the culture and the mindset at the local level. So you are absolutely right that there needs to be a different strategy for hierarchical, organized, international crime cartel type of activity, which is all about business and money, and the prison nexus there. I don't understand what we're doing with our prisons as gang headquarters for national cartel activity. And in California, that's the new threat, is that the cartels are now merged with some prison gang drug distribution, and they are now taking over just a few, less than 1% of the street gangs. I don't want us to go all shock and awe all over the place. I'd rather see us very strategically and surgically go after this threat, but not in a way that destroys the relationships and the proactive prevention and intervention and alternatives.
Ms. Rice, my
Time of the
is up.
gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all our panelists, not just for being here, but for the work you do in your own homes and communities to make us all safer. Mr. King, thank you for what you do in Chicago. You too know the statistics I'm all too familiar with. There are others. We had 6 people shot in 15 minutes 2 nights ago in Chicago. 2010, we had 700 kids get shot in 1 year. I was fortunate. I grew up in a neighborhood where you were grade school, your fears were bad grades or getting braces or not getting a date to the prom or something like that. The #1 fear for kids in Chicago is getting shot. So it's something we have to work on. Mr. King, you're familiar with my predecessor, who's now the mayor of the city of Chicago. He recently has brought on Ceasefire, the group, for over $1 million to try to intervene. I assume you're familiar with their work?
Yes.
What's your assessment of a group like this attempting to intervene in the hostilities that take place and stop them before they happen?
So I think that groups like Ceasefire are integral parts of this problem. You mentioned that #1 fear for inner city youth is getting shot. I would also say that for many people, many young people, getting shot is a badge of honor. And so while no one wants to get shot, in certain communities, including those in Chicago, there are some young people who believe that by getting shot, they have somehow proven something to other gang members, to their families, to their communities. And so they aspire to engage in violence for that reason, so they can get that badge of honor. Groups like Ceasefire and other programs in our city and schools have a unique opportunity to engage with young people so that they understand not only that they should not be engaging in violence, but that they should in no way view violence as something to be celebrated or something to be aspired to. You should not look at violence or a bullet wound as a badge of honor. So I'm a huge fan and supporter of Ceasefire. One of our campuses is located in the Englewood community. Ceasefire has a very strong presence in the Englewood community, and I think they make a real positive difference.
Thank you. Ms. Rice, you're familiar with such groups that attempt to intervene, and could you comment on how you've seen them work in your community?
Gang intervention, for street gang intervention, is a critical part of any comprehensive strategy where you have a level of entrenchment and gang saturation that requires this kind of activity. I don't like having to work with former gang members to help reduce the violence. That is annoying, and it is not something that law enforcement likes to do. But Commander Green and Chief Beck and Chief Bratton and we have learned that when you have 100,000 gang members and you've got 7% of them that are violent at an extraordinary level, your city has an epidemic. When you have an epidemic, you can't hand out fly swatters to fight a malaria epidemic, and you can't just arrest one at a time. You've got to use things like gang intervention. It has to be professionalized. LA City, under Mayor Villaraigosa, has a gang academy. It's the Levita Academy. Can you believe we have an academy for gang intervention workers to train them to work with police, to protect funeral homes, to protect emergency rooms? We don't have emergency docs getting shot up anymore because gang intervention intercedes. They stop the rumors, and as Chief Beck says, their job is to stop the retaliation shooting, the next shooting. So I caution people, if you're going to use gang intervention, it has to be done carefully. It has to be done with an enormously high level of skill.
Thank you, Commander.
My only follow-up comment on that is to be effective, it has to work hand in hand with law enforcement. They have to coordinate because it's a preventive strategy. You know, we'd have a candlelight vigil, and it would get shot up by another gang looking for more victims. And now, with intervention, they'll call us and ask for us to put a black and white out. You know, historically, our only strategy was after a funeral, when emotions are already high, we put gang cops into that neighborhood to make sure we didn't have retaliation shootings, and that only inflamed it more. Now I can have interventionists pay attention to that and call me if it starts to spin up. And as you build that level of interaction between law enforcement and intervention, it's extraordinarily successful.
Thank you, Mr. Sheriff, in the brief time we have.
Yeah, thank you, sir. You know, I think that intervention also goes along with analytics. These folks talked about, you know, when you have a shooting, you can predict in some cases, particularly with gangs, where that next shooting is going to happen. I don't mean right down to the individual, but most of the time law enforcement understands what is the underlying conflict, whether it was something ongoing, whether it's turf, narcotics, something else. But using analytics and intelligence-led policing, we have a pretty good idea where the next shooting is going to occur. Then it's our job to work with our community outreach workers or whatever resources we have available on the prevention side.
Thank you. I want to thank my mayor for his efforts as well.
Yeah, gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. My first question is for Commander Green and Sheriff Stanek. I understand that the majority of the investigations and prosecutions would be at the state level. For those that may find their way into the federal system, are there specific statutory changes you would recommend, evidentiary changes that you would recommend, or sentencing enhancements or sentencing guideline changes that you would recommend for us?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Well, from my perspective, it would be sentencing enhancements for felons with guns and a very concerted approach by the U.S. attorneys to prosecute felons with firearms, those that are prohibited. You know, every few years we see a new tactic, new approach, a new round of whether or not they're going to work with local law enforcement or not, or where they set that bar. But we need the bar set fairly low. Felons in possession of a firearm, those who are prohibited, those are the ones that we need prosecuted on the federal level. That federal sentencing side versus our individual states is a big hammer to hold over their heads and helps us combat gangs and the violence on the streets in our communities.
Commander, before you answer, let me ask this, because it's been a while since I was in the system. Way back when, anyone under the age of 18 was considered a minor by the federal criminal justice system, and it required the specific approval of the Attorney General to waive them up and prosecute them as an adult. Is that still the case? Have you tried to waive 16 and 17-year-olds up? Interestingly enough, they're considered adults in most state systems, but they're considered minors in the federal system.
Mr. Chair, members, I believe that is still the case, and that is one of the things that maybe Congress could help us with on local law enforcement efforts.
So sentencing enhancements for non-22G cases or felon in possession cases, and getting ATF, which would be the agency of jurisdiction, to focus on garden variety felon in possession cases as opposed to what other priorities they may feel like they have.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members, I would concur with that.
All right. Snitching. I had an African-American chief of police in my home city, and the biggest frustration he had was the unwillingness of some folks to cooperate with law enforcement. How do we get around that, and how do you also brush back allegations of racial profiling when the gangs in and of themselves are fairly homogenous and might lend themselves to certain kind of profiling? I'm not suggesting racial, but we're kidding ourselves if we don't think some of these gangs are homogenous.
So I'll go back to the first part of that question regarding what you call snitches. I think it's important to have the funding there to relocate witnesses so that they feel comfortable if they testify that they won't be killed. That is a reality in some of these neighborhoods, that people won't testify because they're afraid for their life. We come back to talking about gun and gun enhancements. In a lot of these neighborhoods, young men feel that they have to be armed to survive. They'd much rather get caught with a gun and prosecuted than they would get caught without a gun and get killed. And so until that comfort zone has changed, that won't change. The reality is we have to target behavior and violence. No matter what community it is, it's about targeting the violent behavior. And so it doesn't matter whether it's white, Hispanic, black, it's about the violence. And if we go back to the data, and as you look at that data and you strategically enforce, you've got to target the violent individuals and their actions to be successful.
Mr. King, my final question would be to you with respect to schools. What are they doing that's good, that's right, that's helpful? You have the whole aspect of educable neglect where parents are, in South Carolina, we experimented with actually holding the parents accountable when their kids don't go to school, which it may be a novel concept in some other parts of the country, but it made sense to us. So what works and what doesn't work from your perspective?
So one of the things that we've been hearing a lot during this testimony have been words like comprehensive wraparound and strategic approaches. I think the same words apply inside schools. And if schools take a comprehensive approach towards the education of the child, and by that I mean not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, it also means the social emotional development of the child. You mentioned the issue of snitching and the perception that if you are a witness to a crime, you should not say anything. Either you will be retaliated against or you will be perceived negatively. Well, an opportunity that schools have is to actually educate young people out of that mind of thinking and educate them to understand that they have a responsibility not just to themselves but to their communities. And part of that responsibility is bearing witness to what's going on and making sure that they are taking the steps necessary to keep themselves and others safe. So I believe that schools that engage in those types of practices, focusing on the social emotional development of children as well as the education of them, of their intellects, I think are the schools that are going in the right direction.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
Well, as a Congress member from Los Angeles, I'm so proud to be here with two outstanding witnesses from Los Angeles who've done such great work on this issue, and Commander Green from the LAPD, Connie Rice, somebody that I've known for many, many years in Los Angeles, and in fact who is an icon in the Los Angeles area for doing such outstanding work on so many different issues. Welcome to both of you. Commander Green, it's always a pleasure to have someone from the district who is sharing information on the positive things that are occurring back in the community. With that said, in your testimony, you shared that Los Angeles crime is experiencing the lowest crime rate it's seen since 1959. That's a remarkable feat for such a large urban city. The trend also includes a reduction in gang crime. To what do you credit this decrease?
There's a number of different things, Congressman, Congresswoman, that are attributed for the success. It's a cocktail of suppression, intervention, but it's partnership. It's partnership with our city family, with our federal partners, to actually go out and do something other than what we've done before with suppression. If we don't get in and build relationships in the community, effective relationships in all parts of our community, the police are seen as the antagonist. And with that relationship, we can't move forward. Both the police department and the committee want the same thing. They don't want the violence predominantly. So we need to get in, and I talked about the community safety partnership earlier in the housing developments. For years, it's been antagonistic. 7 months worth of work in those developments with 10 cops doing nothing but community work and not suppression. We've seen dramatic reductions in shootings and homicides because we're building a community. We're taking on the root causes. Kids can get to school safely. They don't have to worry about getting killed walking to and from school. Cops are mentoring people. And a lot of people say it's not law enforcement's job to be involved in all that. But if law enforcement isn't, we don't have the opportunity to build those critical relationships and a role model that we need to get information from the community to respond to so we can make it better. So it's not one thing, but the federal and the local partnerships so that it's more of a task force response. Intelligence gathering, technology, all those things have helped dramatically.
Ms. Rice, DOJ has several grant programs that provide funding to state and communities to combat youth gangs, gang-related violence, and juvenile delinquency. Are these grant programs sufficiently flexible in their targeted purpose areas to allow funding to be used to combat the evolving nature of gangs? If not, what are the shortcomings? And would these programs be appropriate to fund initiatives that can confront both street gangs and transnational criminal gangs? And if LA is showing such sustained declines in gang violence, shouldn't some federal funding go to funding a strategy this effective?
Yes, the comprehensive strategy is something the DOJ understands. But there are very few places that are getting a comprehensive footprint. It's hard to put this stuff together. It's hard to make agencies work together, to make people who used to sue one another work together. It's not easy stuff, but what we're saying from Los Angeles is that that's what has made the difference. We all got in the boat and rowed. We decided to become an orchestra as opposed to disparate musicians. And we have a conductor, Guillermo Cespedes, and the mayor, and the chief, LAPD Chief Charlie Beck. So it is a quantum leap of improvement. And it's hard to do, and it goes against all of the political DNA that we have. We have these Darwinian, competitive funding strategies. It's inadequate levels of funding, and it's not strategic enough. So I think that the federal dollars could go much further if they insisted on where there's a high enough level to warrant it, this comprehensive wraparound approach, as opposed to funding just, now we have to fund the 1,000 Points of Light too. We have to fund the individual service givers. We have to fund the individual schools, those are very, very critical. It's not either or. You've got to do both and. I'm not sure that the federal level gets what we're talking about. It hasn't been seen anywhere. You've seen intervention interruption, you've seen wonderful schools, you've seen disparate points of light. You haven't seen the halogen torch of the comprehensive strategy yet. And in LA, we just have a footprint. We haven't done the full wraparound yet. We don't have the county agencies yet. We're not reformed. Well, we've got to reform probation. I may have to do another lawsuit. We may be back in lawsuit territory there. But they've got $24 billion of our money, and these kids are drowning in these institutions. So we have a long way to go in LA, but what we're here to say is that war didn't get us but so far. We backed away from war on each other and war on gangs, started doing war on the violence and the conditions that hurt these kids. And as a result, the crime has plummeted, the trust has gone up, and we're seeing whole new dynamics. What I would love for this committee to do is to take the new threats, which are real, but take a step back and don't do the normal throw more money. Yes, law enforcement needs more resources, but mainly for cybercrime. We have enough laws, we have enough enhancements, we have enough folks going to prison. What we don't have is a strategy that's smart enough to start getting to the cultural mindset, norm change, behavior change that will end the cult of death that gets passed on and with gang members. That's what we need to be after.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you. I thank the chairman for calling this, and I appreciate the 4 panelists here today. I can sense your passion about this issue, and so I appreciate you being here today. I wasn't planning to ask this, but I want to follow up on what you just said about more, if I heard correctly, Ms. Rice, more money about cyber crime. Explain that. Explain that to me.
The new threats are fascinating to me. It's from the cartels. The cartels have been in LA for at least 20 years, but now they're really setting up shop. And that's kind of, so the transnational nature has expanded. But the, I'm sorry, what was the question?
About the cyber.
Yes, cyberspace. I'm sorry, I'm 56 and have no short-term memory. That's increased by 1,500%. The smart gangsters are no longer hanging out on the corners. Those are the dummies, okay? The smart guys have gone now, they're online, and the new victim class is middle class. They're going after our bank accounts, okay? So the smart gangsters, they're all in cyberspace now. They're really smart, and they're scary smart, all right? And they're probably not going to get caught now. It's no longer about being on the corner slinging dope or threatening people. They're not into that anymore. So this is morphing into the more organized crime area where you're really after money. You're not about identity and turf. And we have to make sure that our strategies match the ecology of the gang and the psychology of the gang. So the cyberspace, I find because law enforcement needs money to get really smart, geeky guys like the Big Bang Theory guys into law enforcement, okay? I love that show. I just discovered it. I'm so slow, I didn't even know it was on. But bottom line, we have got, and they've got to be super smart. We've got to get those kinds of brains into law enforcement. That's going to take a lot of money. They don't even have the right kinds of laptops. We need the technology reimbursed. I'm not about taking money from law enforcement. I'm about boosting the prevention and intervention and the wraparound strategies at the same time you fund them working together.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I think in many ways you're right that we have, those are major concerns. In the few minutes that I have left, maybe perhaps starting with the commander, I want to talk about the prison aspect of this because I worry that what is supposed to conceptually be the Department of Corrections really ends up being more of a breeding ground and a training ground to take somebody who's maybe been a bad actor, and instead of putting them in the right direction, the rate of recidivism and other things goes up, and they come out with more context, more information, more knowledge, and become more dangerous. Is that just a fallacy? Is that just a perception that we get on television, or is that the reality of what you're seeing on the streets?
Well, that's the reality of what we see on the streets, sir. You send an individual that is a poor criminal into the criminal justice system, he comes out a very good criminal.
So what do we do about that?
Well, one of the things we have to do is typically within the first 24, 48, 72 hours, those first couple of weeks are critical when they get out to stop them from going back to the same pattern that they've had historically when they're on the street. They start hanging out with the same folks who start using the same substances that they did before. But before you know it, they've offended and they're back in custody. And that's why we have the recidivism rate that we do. We look at the comprehensive strategy about preparing them for life on the street. It's got to be with tools to avoid that. And we've talked about it. We've started looking at reentry. We've toyed with it, but we haven't put enough effort into reentry to prepare, especially in the day we live in now in California. Lots of folks coming back out. Unless we're able to give them those tools to survive, they're going to go right back into the system.
Sheriff?
Mr. Chair, members, thank you. It's a great question, and I concur with the commander about reentry. Many of the folks who come out of our prisons, and I come from Minnesota, we have one of the lowest incarceration rates, highest probation rates anywhere in the country. But reentry is what's important to us. We have to give these folks basic job skills, housing, keep them out of that life of crime, help turn them around. It starts when they're in prison through some of the programs, but really when they get out, that support network to help them succeed, because we all know that the vast majority of the folks who go to prison are coming back out.
If I could just add something, I think it should not come as a surprise to any of us that someone who goes to prison because they didn't feel they had any opportunity or any options, we shouldn't be surprised that when they leave prison, they don't feel like they have any options and opportunities. And so it is critical that we do education on both ends, that we educate before to try to keep people from going into prison. But then if they do go to prison, we have to make sure we're educating them when they come out as has been said, but also that we're making sure that as a society we're providing opportunities as opposed to stigma for folks who come out of prison. Otherwise, they will have no choice but to go back to the same ways that got them in prison in the first place.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. It seems to me that all across the nation there is a stigma in the urban areas in terms of being black and being a male. And that leads to a disproportionate share of our prison system, both state and federal, being represented by that particular demographic, black males, young black males in particular. But now I refuse to believe that there are not other criminal gangs who have a different hue than the Latino or the African American street gangs. Gangs are doing other things like trafficking in drugs in the suburbs, in the rural areas. There even are prison gangs that such as the Aryan Brotherhood or the Nazi lowriders and even a gang like the Mafia. I know we don't call them a gang, but those kinds of organizations may be a little more difficult to investigate and bring charges against than just a street level group of young people calling themselves the Fabulous 25 or some group like that. It's easy to get those street level crack dealers and lock them up, sentencing guidelines, send them away for a long time. It's easy to do that. We got assault weapons out there. Have you seen an increase in the numbers of assault weapons on the streets, Commander Green and Sheriff Stanek?
Sure, in Los Angeles, we've seen that increase for the last 20 years. We've had assault weapons on the street. It's not a new phenomenon. It stayed, and the consistency of those numbers has never slowed down.
Sheriff.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members, you're absolutely correct, Congressman. We've seen a dramatic increase in the amount of both automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons. You've seen law enforcement go from 38 caliber revolvers to semi-automatic handguns. We transitioned from 12-gauge shotguns to semi-automatic rifles, just to match the firepower.
Okay, thank you. Now, the people trafficking in those weapons are not street-level drug dealers. But they do end up with some of these weapons. There's no doubt about that. And but what kind of focus do we have on where those guns are coming from? Who's trafficking in those guns? Could it be the folks at the unlicensed gun dealers at the gun shows that make their way around the country? Are the unlicensed gun show dealers criminals themselves? What kind of record do they have? Who organizes all of these gun shows going across the country, and what happens to all of the or the multitude of weapons that end up on the streets of America, in the inner cities? What happens, with those groups? We don't see a lot of, or we don't hear anything about prosecution of Aryan Nations gang member for selling drugs on the outside of the prison, some kind of a network. Can you talk to us about the street-based racist gangs? Are they gangs? Are they considered gangs? And is the Mafia considered a gang?
Sure, when it comes to street-based enforcement, we target the most violent areas. We, as the sheriff talked about earlier, we use data, and that pushes our enforcement so we can try and stop the violence. with, as with narcotics, with guns, we partnership with the ATF, and we have continued federal or partnerships with the federal entities. And just as we do with narcotics, we try and work narcotics backward from that street dealer as with guns. And we get guns off suspects in the street, we get them in homicide investigations, we roll back in partnership with them to try and find out where that gun came from. And then as they can, we work with our federal partner for federal prosecutions if you get violations of that federal law.
The gentleman's time has expired. Before recognizing the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Adams, the chair will state that if any other members come in before Ms. Adams concludes her questioning, they'll be recognized. But if they come in once I recognize Mr. Scott and then myself for wrapping up the questions, they won't be recognized. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the witnesses here, and I'm going to come at it from a little bit different since I spent over 17 years in law enforcement and have investigated a lot of these crimes. I heard my colleague talking about basically racial-based gangs. There are those, but there are mostly gangs that have become the families, so to speak, quote-unquote families of these children or these young adults. Would any of you disagree with that fact? So with that, what we've seen is with the breakdown of the family unit over the years, a lot of these young adults and young children have come to be involved in gangs based on the family style unit that they present. And even though I don't agree with the enforcer that they have in the units or those type of things, I think they're very dangerous for our communities and for our families. I've listened to a lot of this, and I'm amazed to hear and see that we have such international gangs, such as the Somali gangs, Sheriff, that you're dealing with in your county. Can you explain to me a little bit about that? How are the Somali gangs different than other gangs you've seen come into your area? I mean, I've seen the multinational gangs come into our area in Florida, so I was just kind of curious.
Sure, Mr. Chair, members, with Somali gangs, as I had indicated earlier, a different way of policing, much more cultural-centric, different techniques and tactics than maybe some of the other traditional gangs we've talked about here this morning, all the way from witness tampering to, the not so much narcotics-based like some street gangs or turf-oriented, but rather they do so for other reasons, some cultural, some specific, but requires a different law enforcement response.
And isn't it true that gang members don't normally go to gun shops or gun shows to purchase guns? They're usually buying them on the black market or through their avenues other than anything that would be otherwise seen as legal?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members, I think you're right on. What we see in our communities across the United States from local law enforcement perspective is primarily through straw purchases. Someone who is legally able to purchase a firearm will go in, make that purchase, and then sell it to someone else. Either they had that intent when they walked into that gun store or bought from an FFL, a federal firearms license dealer, or they got that idea afterwards. But each of these guns that we recover on the street, working with our ATF partners in these task forces, we trace those guns back to the source. And that's what gives us our information and indication of where these guns actually come from and what we're seeing today.
And the source could also be from burglaries, thefts of that nature?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members, as I indicated earlier, we see a lot of it. I indicated there was a gun store burglary in Minnetonka, Minnesota. I think 58 firearms taken. 27 of those 58 have not been recovered, but for those other 30 plus, and we found them at shootings, robberies, homicides. So the purpose of that burglary was to put those guns in the hands of criminals, primarily the local street gangs.
And Ms. Rice, I was looking at something that you had written on pages 147 and 148 of your book. You tell a very disturbing story about a child soldier who did the killing for his gang and merely would have to go to juvenile. It says to JV. I've seen that also in my community where I was a law enforcement officer in Central Florida, where sometimes the youngest because of their age in the gang would be given the most violent acts, so that they would only be given a very small sentence based on their age, not like somewhat of someone in an older age group would get. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree with you that the exploitation of the youngest ones is an outrage, and it's our failure. What are we doing letting gangs take a hold of little kids and turn them into assassins? When I met my first child assassin, I was appalled at myself first. Where was I when they turned this kid? How do we allow children to fall into the hands of these fiends? And that started my journey. So for me, this is we have to protect children. If we can't keep kids safe enough to go to school, what are we doing? We're not running a democracy here. If we allow this to happen in our backyards, we are failing. Together, we are failing as adults. So I'm glad that you brought that up. This, for me, is about the children. The poorest rural children are now suffering in a methamphetamine economy that we are not addressing. And it isn't going to help to just lock up all of their parents. We have got to look at that ecosystem with the eye of protecting these children and dealing with the root causes. You give these families an alternative to cooking meth, they're not going to be doing this stuff. So I'm really begging the committee to take a very hard look at the harder work of doing these wraparound ecosystem strategies that get at the root causes. That's how you protect kids. You don't let these neighborhoods and these hot spots sink to a level where we can actually find kids being taken out of their families, given a gun, and instructed in how to murder. That's what I found in Los Angeles. That's what I said in my book was unacceptable. You don't let children die like this. And we have no excuse for it in this country. But if we keep just focusing on locking people up, we're not going to get to the wraparound strategies.
Okay,
Thank
the
you.
gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rice, we heard about the desirability of trying more juveniles as adults. Don't all the studies on trying more juveniles as adults conclude that if you pursue that policy, the crime rate will increase?
I don't know whether the crime rate is going to increase. What I do know is that our level of failure is going to increase. There are some juveniles that should be
Now, if you increase the number, not if you try any juveniles, but if you increase the number of juveniles being tried, the crime rate will go up.
I don't know about the
not just trying any juvenile. Some juveniles, like you said, but they're all being tried as adults now. If you increase the number, you're talking about the marginal children that the studies have shown the crime rate will go up because they'll be treated in a situation where they can either be locked up or let go, no services that can be provided in the juvenile facility.
Congressman, you bring up a very important point, because the kids that I find, the vast majority of them, if you put them into prison, it's like graduate school. It's like college for crime.
Well, that's what happens when you try more juveniles as
That's
adults.
right. When they get out, then we haven't reformed them, we haven't rehabilitated them. But
now, one of the things you've talked about is investing in prevention, early intervention, wraparound services, and obviously that costs money. That's what we're trying to do with the Youth Promise Act. Could you give me an idea of how much Los Angeles County spends right now on incarceration?
On incarceration?
Right. Is it fair to say that it's billions? I was told that $11 billion state budget for corrections, 40% of the inmates were from Los Angeles.
It's definitely billions statewide. It is definitely billions statewide.
But those from Los Angeles that go into the state system, plus Sheriff Baca's budget has got to be at least $500 million or more, counting juveniles. The mayor's gang reduction youth development program, do I understand that cost $168 million?
I wish that much were spent on it, but it's more like, my understanding is that it's closer to, it's below $100 million.
Well, compared to the corrections budget, it's peanuts.
It's tiny.
Now, in Boyle Heights, I understand there's a 44% reduction in crime in Boyle Heights.
That sounds right.
Do you know whether or not the teen pregnancy rate also went down? Because usually when you have a good crime prevention program, you prevent crime, dropouts, drug abuse, and teen pregnancy.
Teen pregnancy in Los Angeles County has been going down for the last 5 years.
You mentioned a difference between MS-13 and other street gangs. Why should they be treated differently?
Because you want to be effective. If you don't understand the etymology of the gang, you can respond to it in a way that actually makes it stronger and spreads its mindset. So street gangs and turf, old-fashioned street gangs, where you've got kids running away from stuff and finding an alternative family, they've got to be treated differently from folks who are heading up Yakuza and the Russian mob and the Italian mob and all of those, and the drug cartels.
And for those very serious cartel-type gangs on one side, but the others should be treated with wraparound services. Can you tell us a little bit about what those wraparound services are?
Yes, you do an analysis of the hotspot. You figure out where the dynamics are and who the players are. Then you design a system to go after each cohort of kids, because we focus on children. It's probably because women are heading this. We focus on the kids. And we're trying to keep those kids safe, not just the kids who are at risk of going into the gang, because they're risk prevention. Deputy Mayor Guillermo Cespedes has pioneered a prevention strategy that shows that already a 30% reduction in risk factors, a 49% reduction in gang affiliation. We're talking about gang families. Everybody in the family is a part of the gang, but this newest generation that Deputy Mayor Cespedes is working with has now decided that they're going to go with a more establishment, mainstream, higher level of values and not join the gang. We've got to sustain that. That takes money. We're doing this at a pilot level, but Congressman, if we don't get the investment on this side of Sears, the softer side of Sears, the investment healing side, we're going to just have to do more and more shock and awe, which doesn't work.
Let me see if I can get another question into Mr. King. When students are in your facility and have other opportunities, do they join gangs?
Absolutely, we have students who are approached and recruited to be in gangs. We view our job, or one of our jobs, being to make sure that our students understand that they can say no and that there's a pathway to avoid that type of life. I think that something that we all kind of know, but we don't really have an opportunity to think about or articulate, is that schools can be gangs. We can create very positive gangs within our school systems. We have to be intentional about doing that. What is it that a person who joins, a young person who joins a gang is looking for? Resources, respect, a sense of community, family. These are things that we can provide inside our schools. Many of the best schools in this country, whether they be elementary, high school, or colleges or universities, have very strong cultures. What are strong, positive cultures but another way of doing gangs? And so I think that the work that we do at Urban Prep is very intentional around creating a culture of belonging, a culture of achievement, a culture of an alternative option and pathway to success. And if all schools or more schools did that type of thing, I think we'd see greater levels of success with our young people in keeping them safe and keeping them out of gangs.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair will recognize himself for the final round of questioning. Let me start with you, Ms. Rice. I get a little concerned every once in a while that various types of law enforcement agencies don't work together. And they don't like to interact with what I will refer to generically as educational and social services agencies. Who is out of the loop in Los Angeles?
Who is out of the loop? Well, the folks who are AWOL, in my humble opinion, are a number of the county agencies. The county has most of the safety net in LA. And we need probation at the table. We need the county services to be in conjunction with the cities. What we've done at the city level has got to be expanded to the county level. The other missing pieces that we do not have are the job creation pieces. Father Greg Boyle is absolutely right, and the only epidemiological long-term study that correlates with a reduction in violent gang crime in Los Angeles is the longitudinal study that showed the only factor that correlated with the reduction was job creation. You gave these guys a job, and when we do the Summer Night Lights, Congressman, you'll be amazed. You know what the gangsters ask for? We have to actually ask permission to do these programs because they have so much control in LA. When we ask them, when intervention goes in, do you want to know what they ask for? They want to be trained as firefighters. They want to become cops. They want mainstream jobs. That piece of it is completely not there. So we have a partial comprehensive footprint in LA. We're doing more than any other region in the country. That's why our gang crime, in my opinion, is still going down while everybody else's is spiking. We could lose it in a year. We could get a new crack. We could get a new threat from the cartels, and it could all go up in smoke. Okay. But for this 5 years, Mr. Chairman, we have had an incredible run. Take a look at our stats. You won't find them
They are very impressive.
Anywhere.
Let me ask one question about the prisons. Are the prisons in the loop in having an integrated way of attacking this? Because we've had testimony here that the cartels are basically using the lockup as their headquarters.
The prisons are completely out of loop. In fact, they're part of the problem. I can't crack the corrections guards. I'm too tired and too old. Somebody else is going to have to take that fight.
I think there are a few governors of your state that have had that problem too.
Absolutely. No, I don't understand how gangs and the prison gangs and the cartels control what goes in the streets. Now, there's a double-edged sword here. I think that our drive-bys, you don't hear about drive-bys anymore. We used to have 7, 8, 11 a week. Drive-by shootings, nuts, just annihilation of people at bus stops and stuff. You don't hear about that as much in LA. Why? Because the prison gang put out an order that said if you do any more drive-bys that hit kids, you're going to be dead by noon. It's a very complicated, perverted situation because the control is so high. They control our prisons. Either days, I can't go into California prisons because the gangs are acting up. So I think we need to stop our delusion about who's in control here. They collect taxes, they run drug cartels, and we do need targeted suppression that goes after organized crime. But we need to distinguish that from saturating a community, taking all of the men and young men out of that community, and then that community dies because we've locked everybody up.
Okay, let me ask one question of Commander Green and Sheriff Stanek. In 2002, Chairman Conyers, or soon-to-be Chairman Conyers, and I, as chairman of the committee, ended up putting together a Department of Justice reauthorization bill, which was the first that was passed in 23 years, which did pass both houses and was signed by the President. One of the features of that bill was to try to make Department of Justice grants more fungible so that you could move money around within the various DOJ programs. What has been your experience, each of you, on whether it's fungible enough in terms of what you have to do your jobs to combat gangs? So, who wants to be first?
I talked about the federal partnerships earlier. A lot of those federal partnerships are successful because of the funding that they bring and the ability to move that around. Things on the street change continually, Congressman, and for us to be agile enough to address those problems, that funding source has got to be able to move around, whether it's between the FBI or DEA or ATF, so that they can.
I was talking about the local grant programs. Before that, when a local municipality applied for a federal grant, they have to try to make sure that they applied for a grant in each of the cubby holes, and they got money for each of the cubby holes. And then when they did get the grant, they couldn't move it out of the cubby hole that they got the grant in. Have you experienced a problem with that?
I have. Specifically, as we identify those needs, what I'd like to see is the funding to look specifically at the need and be able to move it around for that need. Because the needs, if we apply for grant funding today, it could be months, more like years, before that grant funding becomes available. Mm-hmm. And by the time it's available, the technology has changed, the need has changed, and so much a quicker system.
So what you're telling us is DOJ ought to speed up the grant approval process.
Yes, sir.
Sheriff Stanek, you're last but not least.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members, and thank you very much for allowing us to testify today. You know, on behalf, I think, of sheriffs across this country, we would concur with what you just suggested, which is to give us the ability that when we apply for a grant, that we don't have to target each individual grant, but rather can use those monies as the needs dictate. Every day in my agency of 1,100 plus personnel, we reprioritize, refocus what we're doing in order to combat what's happening on the streets or in our communities. That grant funding is important and essential to us to be able to do that, whether it's burn JAG monies, whether it's COPS monies, you name it. But I need to be able to have that flexibility because what happens today may change 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road for us.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a hearing that is much more enlightening, educational, and hopeful than I had planned it would be when I walked into the room and started it out. And I would like to thank all of you for really doing a very good job in pointing out differing ways to approach the gang problem. So thanks for coming to D.C. and sharing your views with us. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witnesses, which we will forward and ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as they can so that they may be made part of the record. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit any additional materials for inclusion in the record. With that, again, I thank the witnesses, and without objection, the hearing is adjourned.